Why the Archons fear the name Yeshua? The hidden frequency of awakening in ancient Gnostic texts. For centuries, the name of Jesus has been spoken across the world in prayer, devotion, and faith. Yet few people realize that the original name spoken in his own language was not Jesus, but yet, according to ancient mystical traditions preserved in early Christian writings, names carried more than identity. They carried vibration and spiritual authority. Some texts, discovered among the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, suggest that the forces governing the material world feared the awakening of human consciousness. These forces were described symbolically as the Archons' powers that maintained the illusion of separation between humanity and the divine source. But hidden within the teachings surrounding Yeshua lies a sound that reminds the soul of its forgotten origin. And according to the wisdom preserved in ancient spiritual traditions, that remembrance is precisely what the Archons cannot withstand. Among the mystical traditions connected to the early followers of Yeshua, the universe was often described as a layered reality in which spiritual light existed beyond the visible world. The material realm, according to many of the texts discovered in Nag Hammadi, was influenced by forces called Archons. These beings were not always understood as physical entities, but as symbolic representations of powers that maintain ignorance and prevent humanity from awakening to its divine origin. In several Gnostic writings, the Archons appear as guardians of a system designed to keep the human soul focused only on the material world. Their influence operates through distraction, fear, and the constant reinforcement of the idea that human beings are separated from the divine source. As long as this illusion remains unchallenged, the soul forgets its true nature and continues to move within the limitations imposed by the lower realms of existence. The early spiritual communities that studied the teachings of Yeshua believed that his mission was precisely to break this cycle of forgetfulness through symbolic teachings, parables, and sacred language. He pointed people toward the inner awakening that the Gnostics later called Gnostic. This awakening was not simply intellectual understanding, but a direct recognition of the divine presence within the human spirit. According to these traditions, the Archons could maintain their influence only as long as humanity remained unaware of its origin. Once a person remembered the divine spark within, the structures that held the soul in confusion began to weaken. In this sense, awakening was not merely a spiritual idea, but a transformation of perception that allowed the individual to see beyond the illusions of the material order. This is why the name Yeshua became so significant in early mystical traditions. For the first followers who spoke Aramaic, the name carried meaning and resonance that went far beyond a historical figure. It reminded the soul of the presence of divine salvation and the possibility of liberation from the powers that governed the lower world. And in the symbolic language of the Gnostic texts, this remembrance marked the beginning of the soul's return to the light. In the ancient world, names were never considered ordinary labels. They were believed to contain the essence of identity and the resonance of spiritual meaning. Within the Aramaic language spoken by Yeshua and his earliest followers, words carried layers of significance that extended far beyond simple communication. The sound of a name could evoke memory, alignment, and spiritual awareness within the listener. The name Yeshua itself holds a meaning deeply connected to restoration and divine assistance. Derived from a root associated with salvation and deliverance, the name reflects the mission attributed to Yeshua in early spiritual traditions. For the communities that preserved his teachings, speaking this name was not merely remembering a teacher, but acknowledging the presence of divine help entering human experience. Some interpreters of the Gnostic texts suggest that the symbolic fear attributed to the Archons represents their inability to control a consciousness that has awakened to its divine origin. When the human soul recognizes its connection with the divine source, the structures of illusion begin to lose their authority. The name Yeshua, in its original vibration, becomes a reminder of that connection. In T's Sensei, the power associated with the name is not magical in a superficial way. Its significance lies in what it awakens within the human spirit. When spoken with understanding, the name becomes a gateway to remembrance, a signal that the soul has begun to recognize the light that exists beyond the limitations of the material world. Imagine beginning your journey with the two most powerful Aramaic words that open everything. A complete guide, correct sound, full meaning, and sacred protocol exists for those who feel the call. Check the pinned comment. The early followers of Yeshua believed that awakening begins with remembering truths that were never truly lost. Through sacred words, teachings, and symbols, they sought to remind humanity of the divine spark within. And according to the wisdom preserved in the ancient texts, that remembrance is the first step toward freedom from the powers that thrive on spiritual forgetfulness. Within the mystical worldview, preserved in several Gnostic writings, the universe is not merely a physical structure, but a living hierarchy of consciousness. Above the visible world exists a realm of divine fullness, often described as the pleroma, the source of light and wisdom from which the human spirit originally emerged. According to this perspective, the material world is only a shadow of that higher reality. The Archons, in this symbolic framework, represent forces that maintain the illusion of separation between humanity and the divine origin. The ancient teachers who preserved these ideas believed that the greatest threat to this illusion was awakening. As long as human beings remained unaware of their spiritual nature, the structures that governed the material realm remained unquestioned. But once the soul began to recognize its origin in the divine light, the influence of those structures weakened. Awakening was therefore seen as a shift in perception that allowed the individual to see beyond the limitations of the visible world. In several interpretations of Gnostic teachings, the name Yeshua represents the reminder of this awakening. The sound of the name, spoken in its original Aramaic form, was believed by early communities to carry a resonance that pointed directly to divine assistance and restoration. The power associated with it did not lie in the sound alone, but in the consciousness that recognized the meaning behind it. For those early seekers, sacred language functioned as a bridge between the visible and invisible worlds. When a word connected to divine wisdom was spoken with understanding, it awakened memory within the soul. This remembrance gradually dissolved the illusions that kept the human spirit focused only on the lower realms of existence. If you feel drawn to go further, a guide already exists, the two most important Aramaic words that symbolize the beginning of everything. Correct sound, full meaning, and a sacred protocol for those two words. The door is open. Check the pinned comment. The mystical traditions surrounding Yeshua often emphasize that the awakening of consciousness is not achieved through force, but through recognition. When the soul remembers the light from which it came, the entire structure of perception begins to change. In that moment, the illusions maintained by the Archons begin to lose their influence, and the path towards spiritual freedom gradually becomes visible. The early spiritual communities, who are reflected on the teachings of Yeshua, often spoke about awakening as a process rather than a single moment of realization. According to their understanding, the human soul moves through layers of perception that gradually reveal the deeper structure of existence. At first, life appears governed only by material circumstances, but as awareness grows, the presence of a higher order begins to emerge. Within the symbolic language of the Gnostic texts, the Archons represent the forces that maintain the first layer of perception. Their influence encourages humanity to remain focused on fear, competition, and limitation. When consciousness is absorbed entirely in these patterns, the deeper reality of the divine presence remains hidden. This is why awakening was described as a form of liberation from the illusions that dominate ordinary awareness. The name Yeshua, when understood within its original cultural and spiritual context, becomes a reminder of this liberation. The meaning associated with the name points toward divine rescue and restoration. For the earliest followers who spoke Aramaic, hearing or speaking the name evoked the recognition that divine help was already present within the fabric of existence. This recognition transforms the relationship between the human spirit and the world around it. Instead of perceiving reality as a closed system governed by struggle, the awakened soul begins to perceive the underlying presence of divine wisdom guiding the unfolding of life. The teachings attributed to Yeshua frequently pointed toward this shift in perception through symbolic sayings and parables. Many of these sayings invite listeners to search within themselves for the kingdom of divine reality. The message repeated across several early traditions is that the kingdom is not located in distant places, but discovered through inner awakening. When this realization begins to unfold, the illusions that once seemed permanent begin to dissolve. In this sense, the symbolic fear of the Archons represents their inability to control a consciousness that has remembered its origin. Once the soul recognizes its connection with the divine source, the structures that maintain spiritual forgetfulness gradually lose their influence, and the journey toward the light that the ancient texts describe begins to reveal itself with increasing clarity as the journey toward awakening continues. The deeper wisdom preserved in the Gnostic traditions begins to reveal why the remembrance of divine origin was considered the greatest transformation a human being could experience. The early followers of Yeshua believed that the soul carries within itself a spark of the divine light that existed before the formation of the material world. This spark, though often forgotten, remains present in every human life, quietly calling the individual back to the source from which it came. According to several interpretations of the ancient texts, the Archons maintain their influence, not through physical domination but through the reinforcement of illusion. They represent the forces that convince the human mind that it is separate, powerless, and confined entirely within the limits of the visible world. As long as the soul believes this narrative, it continues to move within patterns of fear and limitation that prevent it from recognizing its deeper nature. The teachings attributed to Yeshua often pointed beyond these illusions through symbolic language designed to awaken inner perception. When he spoke about the kingdom of heaven being within, he invited listeners to look beyond external authority and rediscover the divine presence that already existed inside their own consciousness. This teaching aligned closely with the Gnostic understanding that salvation was not merely a future event, but a present awakening. In this context, the name Yeshua becomes more than a historical reference. It becomes a reminder of divine assistance entering human awareness. For the early communities that preserved these teachings, remembering this name meant remembering the possibility of liberation from the forces that maintain spiritual ignorance. The sound of the name pointed toward the restoration of a connection that had never truly been lost. Once the soul begins to recognize this connection, the structures of illusion gradually weaken. Fear begins to lose its authority, and the individual starts to perceive life from a place of deeper awareness. In the symbolic language of the Gnostic texts, this transformation represents the moment when the light within the human spirit begins to shine beyond the influence of the arc. The ancient wisdom preserved in the Gnostic traditions ultimately presents awakening as a return to remembrance. Throughout the symbolic stories and teachings associated with Yeshua, the central message remains consistent. The divine presence is not distant from humanity, but hidden within the depths of consciousness itself. When this truth is rediscovered, the entire structure of perception begins to change. The Archons in this symbolic framework represent the forces that attempt to keep the human mind focused only on the surface of reality. They thrive in a world where people forget their origin and identify only with the temporary conditions of the material realm. Yet the moment awareness begins to turn inward, searching for deeper truth, their influence begins to fade. The name Yeshua in its original form serves as a reminder of that turning point. It represents the recognition that divine assistance has always been available to those who seek it with sincerity and understanding. When the soul remembers its connection with the divine source, the illusions that once appeared permanent begin to dissolve. The ancient traditions surrounding the teachings of Yeshua often speak through symbols, stories, and sacred language that invite the listener to look beyond the surface of reality. Within the Gnostic worldview, preserved in texts like those discovered at Nag Hammadi, the universe is described not only as a physical structure but as a living field of consciousness. Human beings, according to these teachings, carry within themselves a spark of the divine light that existed before the formation of the material world. The Archons appear in these writings as symbolic representations of forces that maintain spiritual ignorance. Their influence operates through illusion, convincing the human mind that it is separate from the divine source and confined entirely within the limits of material existence. As long as this illusion remains unquestioned, the soul continues to move through life without recognizing the deeper reality that surrounds it. The message associated with Yeshua offers a different perspective. Through teachings, parables, and sacred expressions rooted in the Aramaic language of his time, he pointed people toward the rediscovery of the divine presence within themselves. In this sense, the name Yeshua becomes more than a historical identity. It becomes a reminder of divine assistance and the possibility of awakening. When consciousness begins to remember its origin, the structures that depend on spiritual forgetfulness gradually lose their power. Fear gives way to awareness. Limitation gives way to understanding. And the soul begins to perceive life through a new lens. The ancient wisdom preserved in these traditions suggests that true liberation does not come from external control of reality, but from the awakening of inner knowledge. And according to the Gnostic teachings, the moment that awakening begins, the journey back to the light has already started. Everything begins with Aramaic words. A complete guide, correct sound, full meaning, and sacred protocol is now available for those ready to start this journey. The door is open. Check the pinned comment. In the next video, I will reveal another sacred Aramaic word connected to the teachings of Jesus. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and write in the comments what you thought of this content.